Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, a brief episode on Aberffraw biscuits. Before we go any further, I'd just like to note that I have an Australian accent, which is really interfering with my pronunciation of that word. In Welsh, it's something closer to Aberffraw. Apologies to any Welsh listeners. Anyway, Aberffraws are the oldest variety of biscuit in Britain. It appears in the historical record just after the game's start date. The Aberffraw biscuit comes from Anglesey, the hothouse of druidic magic. So, what uses can we put it to in Ars Magica campaigns? This biscuit was developed near the town which bears its name. In 1220, Aberffraw was the capital of one of the Welsh kingdoms. It was said the Queen was walking on the shore and found a scallop shell, and then the King ordered biscuits to be made that had the shape of the shell. That's the simple version. Let's unpack that a little, though. The expert who was making these biscuits on the Great British Bake Off suggested that they were linked to the seashells brought home as souvenirs by pilgrims who followed the route to Compostela. St. James's symbol is the scallop shell. Why this should be so is unclear. There are many myths about him armouring a knight with scallop shells. The lines on the shell are said to represent the many paths taken by pilgrims to reach Compostela. Which edge of the shell represents Compostela is a matter of dispute. There's a recipe for Aberffraw biscuits included in this podcast. It was popularised by an early 20th century cookbook. It's not, according to the expert I watched, particularly close to the original recipe. I can believe that because sugar was rare in medieval Wales. She also suggested that the original biscuits contained semolina, this is coarse ground flour, which gave the texture a grittiness reminiscent of beach sand. I've read an alternative that says instead that coarse-grained wholemeal flour was used, so it would be the bran that gave that grittiness. The Cassell recipe also doesn't include pressing the dough into or against a scallop shell to make the final shape or the pattern, and it spells the biscuit Aberffrau using the German Frau. So this is a grainy shortbread biscuit shaped like a seashell. The Aberffraw recipe from Cassell's Household Cookery is quite short. Many household cookery books from the period were quite short because they were meant to be reminders to already competent bakers rather than instruction manuals for people who had not baked before. Aberffraw cakes: beat half a pound of butter to a cream with half a pound of granulated sugar, mix in gradually half a pound of sifted flour, turn the cake out onto a floured pastry board, roll it to the thickness of 1/4 of an inch, cut it in rounds with a tin cutter, and score the tops in diamonds with a sharp knife. Put the cakes on a pan dusted with flour and bake them for 15 minutes in a moderate oven. So that's the recipe. You'll note it doesn't even have temperatures there. Despite the apparent similarity, madeleines will not appear in Europe until the 18th century. There is a folkloric link based around the feeding of pilgrims and the seashell shape. Madeleines are from Lorraine, probably. There is a Welsh company that started making these biscuits commercially. They literally watched the same TV show I did and decided to revive the biscuit. Although they tried historical recipes, they found that certain things like loaf sugar were difficult to obtain and led to a greasy mess, and so they have a modern recipe which is on their website. The URL is in the notes that are on my website. But they're aberffrawbiscuits.com. You'll find it if you go there. Note that their recipe contains very fine flour. It's called corn flour in the UK. It need not be made out of maize. That's American sweet corn. That would make it even lighter than the Cassell version. If you're hunting other recipes online, try calling them Aberffraw cakes, Berffro. For the cooks in the audience, some of the modern versions are a 3-2-1 shortbread. That's 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, 1 part sugar by weight. Mix, rest for 30 minutes, roll, cut, press in the design, bake for 8 to 10 minutes, cool slightly before you rack them. Finer sugar gives you less of a crunch. Chunky sugar crystals could give you a bit more of the sandy texture, either mixed in or sprinkled on top. I've seen some recipes that say you leave the biscuit in the shell while baking. I'd recommend you not do that. But let's move on to story hooks. Although before we do, I'd just like to note that for a really long time I've thought that Ars Magica should do a cookbook. We could just grab the form of curry, throw some unicorn in whenever there is beef, add some plot hooks, and Bob's your uncle. But moving on. Story hooks. Let me ramble for a minute here. There used to be this idea that Australian Aborigines, I'm Australian by the way, Australian Aborigines never fought wars with each other. This doesn't seem likely given the mention of battles in folklore and how good they were at guerrilla fighting once the frontier wars kicked off, but let's let that go. The reason that was given by early anthropologists was that Aboriginal spirituality was so closely tied to the land that if you took another person's territory, you wouldn't know the ways of honouring, appeasing, and avoiding the local spirits there. Now, regardless of how true this was in Australia, it does present us with a mirrored issue in Anglesey. When the Order rolls in and destroys the final holdout of the Diadni, or forces them to flee, the victors take over the Druid lands. There must have been all kinds of weird rituals and folk customs where they weren't sure whether they were important. These biscuits, for example, there's a possibility that these are made to give the fertility of the land to the people of the sea, so they don't take it by force. There was an entire cantref now in Cardiff Bay that was eaten by the sea in one night. It's best for that not to happen again. As an alternative, the biscuits are kind of sacred to St. James. They're sometimes even called James cakes. Might they be keeping something away? Might they be a traditional ward? And if you don't carry them, might whatever this thing is come back? Now, the house that took over most of the British lands of the Diadni was apparently House Titellus, and they're the people who are best suited to deal with these sorts of problems. They like puzzles and they like violence, so there could be a century of the pacification of the land there, and it would be full of looking at things like these biscuits and going, I'm not sure whether we should muck with that. Biscuits as a food for travellers are a late invention. They really only take off on a massive scale when Britain gets railways, in part because the steam technology which drove the railways also drove the imperial expansion that allowed sugar to become cheap. That being noted, redcaps aren't idiots, and a muesli bar, oat bar for those of you in other countries, is just a cookie that you eat outside. I can see the redcaps having specialist bakeries around the place to guarantee resupply for their messengers. When a baker goes missing, a redcap may need help to work out what's happened.